Let's work on a little form project today. I'm going to show you some pretty cool techniques to dry up your forms and make it a lot more clean and natural. So if we take a look at Chrome, here's what I've set up for you. We have a basic form with two inputs, one for a project's name and another for its description. Now here's the backend. You don't need to know Laravel again. I'll go over it in 20 seconds. The page to create the form is this. So we show a view, and if we have any projects, we render them. But right now we don't. Okay, next, when you submit this form and it hits the server, we call this method where we validate the request. And if that fails, a 422 response code will automatically be returned. Otherwise, we will create the project, save it to the database, and then return a successful response. That's all there is to it. Next, if we take a look at this HTML page, here's where we render the projects. You can ignore it. This is what you care about. Here's our form that translates to this. Okay, so we want to enhance this form using Vue. To begin, let's switch back, and if we scroll down, as we've been doing for a while now, we import Axios, Vue, and app.js. Simple CDNs here. If we visit app.js, we have the initial Vue instance, and that's it. To begin, we know that we need to specify some data, right? So we're going to take this in incremental steps. I'm going to show you how we would normally go about a form, and then we're going to extract a couple classes, in fact, to make it that much cleaner. So we have data for the name input, so we're going to do vModel, and then another one for the description, so I will apply that there. This could be a text area, but an input is fine. Anyways, if we switch back and give this a refresh, and if I open up Chrome DevTools, right now, data function should return an object. Yeah, of course. We just have a regular Vue instance. Anyways, if we give that a refresh, now it's squawking because you can't use vModel unless you first declare it. We know this. So name and description. Now if I come back and give that a refresh, we get rid of that. So if we go to our Vue tab, if we have Vue DevTools installed, of course those are blank, but we now have reactivity. So as I populate them, we'll see the values update accordingly. Next, we want to listen for when the form is submitted. So what we could do is go to our form and say submit equals, and maybe just call a method onSubmit, and we'll add that. Submitting. But you're going to see an issue here. If I come back and give it a refresh and we submit it, yes, we get the alert, but then the form tries to submit as it normally would. So we want to prevent the default action of a form, which is to submit. So we can allow for this by using event modifiers. Whether it's submit or key down or at click, you can always add a period and then one of Vue's supported event modifiers, like once, if you only want to click a button once. In our case, if we want to prevent the default action, like event.preventDefault, we could do it like so. So now we're telling Vue, when it submits, go ahead and prevent the default action and then call an onSubmit method. So now we'll get our alert, but it won't submit the form. Great. Now, if we switch back to Sublime, at this point we would want to use Axios to submit a post request to our server. And you'll see on my server, we are responding to this endpoint. So if we post to that URI, we'll hit that store method, where once again, it will validate the request, create the project in the database, and then return a success status. Okay, so I'll paste that in, and then the data, we could hard code it. We could say name equals this.name. We're kind of doing a lot of duplication, but okay. We could try that. We could also just pass this.data. That would be an option as well. So let's give this a shot. I'm going to open up Chrome DevTools, go to our network tab, and we're only listening for XHR requests. So we'll say name and description, create, and let's see what happened here. So we get a 404 response, hit the preview, and we have a not found exception. Now, in this case, what I think it is, if we switch back to app.js, yeah, we need to go from the root of our site. Sorry about that. Anyways, if we give it one more shot, name, description, and we submit this, there we go. So we get a 200 response, project created, which means if I give this a refresh, for now we're just echoing out the project titles or names within an unordered list. So this is working and everything would seem fine, but this is the happy path. So what about when I try to create it, but I didn't populate any of these inputs? Well, of course, in real life, what you should do is for all of your inputs, make sure you add required, so that you get some HTML5 browser validation for free. But just so we can toy around with what it would look like if that's disabled, or even in some browsers like Safari, it doesn't really work. It kind of stinks. You can't rely on it alone. But anyways, if we try it, once again, this should fail validation, right? Like we give it a description, but no name. So it runs, and sure enough, we get a 422. We can't process this entity. We understood it, but you didn't give it to us in the form that we can work with. So we see the response, the name field is required. So this is how Laravel validation works. When you call that validate method, it's going to, if there are errors, return the validation errors. So let's think about this. We could do front-end validation, and then only once that passes, do we submit it to the server. Or sometimes a much simpler way, if you're using something like Laravel, is just allow it to hit the server. And if validation does fail, we will return that. And then on the front end, you can fetch these errors and display it to the user. That's sometimes a simple way to go about it. So that's what we're going to do here. It sounds like we need to catch errors now. So we could do that by saying, if we have a successful request, then we'll get the response and we'll just say, alert, success. We'll work more on that in a few. But if you catch an error, well, in that case, maybe we could assign it here. So like errors will be set to an empty object. But if validation errors were returned from the request, we will update that list. Now, if we want to get the data, so the data associated with the response, this is what we have to do. And in fact, I want you to see this so it's not confusing. So let's console.log the error response so you can check it out. All right, so we submit it, it fails, and if I go to the console, here's the object. So notice the data will contain any errors for both the description and the name. So all we're doing here is saying, one more time, submit. This object here is what we want to assign up here. Okay, so in that case, we'll say this.errors equals error.response.data. Let's try it out. Right now, in our view instance, errors is an empty object. But if we submit the form and it fails, click on it to refresh, now errors is equal to the server validation issues. So now, maybe we could do something like this. I'm using a little CSS framework here, so it'll give me some helpful styling out of the box. But we could say, give me a span of help, and there's a modifier here called isDanger that'll make it small and red. And we could bind that to errors, and let's see what we had before. Errors.name, but then we got to get the first item. So that's a little awkward because, well, we can't depend on that. So for example, if we give it a refresh, I think we're going to get an issue. Yeah, I cannot read property 0 if undefined, and that's because right now that errors object is empty. So maybe we could do something like errors.getName. Maybe that's an object instead. This is something that Laravel Spark does, and I think it's really clean, so I think you'll like it. Yeah, if this is an object, just give me the error or the validation error for name. Okay, so right now that would fail, right? Because errors isn't an object. So let's see what that might look like. Maybe errors is new errors. So let's go ahead and create that class. And then didn't we say we wanted some kind of get method on it where you give it a field name and that will return the errors? Okay, well it sounds like this class then needs to accept the errors, or at the very least it just needs to store the errors. So we'll default that to an empty object. Then when the user tries to get an error, maybe we could just say if this.errors field, so like if you have an error for name, then in that case, we're going to return it. This.errors field, and then you'll remember we have to get that very first item. That's the way Laravel returns it. Fine, we'll do it here. So now, yeah, this is a bit more of an object-oriented way to go about it. We'll create a class to be responsible for these errors. Now, if we scroll down, when we submit it, we post to projects. If we have success, we just do an alert from now. But if it fails, well, we can't do this anymore. Maybe what we could do is something like this. This.errors, and we're going to record the new ones that just came through. So maybe something like that. So it sounds like we have a new method here, record. And all that should do is just update our errors object. Okay, so let's go through this. In our form, when we submit it, we call an onSubmit method. OnSubmit posts to projects, but if there are validation errors or something fails, then we will accept the errors and we're going to record them in our errors object. Next, within our view, we have this little help message, and we want the text to be equal to errors.getName. So if we take a look at that, well, let's imagine that this errors object is empty. There's no validation issues. Well, in that case, it just returns nothing. However, if we recorded some new errors, if we have it, then we record the message that was returned from our server. So let's give this a shot. We're going to create it, but no, we don't see anything. Let's switch back. We get it. Oh, I'm sorry. We forgot to return it. Okay, anyways, one more time. We create, and there you go. It just works. So now what about description? Well, let's do the same thing. Down here, we'll add another section to get the description. So if we give this a shot, now they're both failing. Great. And now I want you to remember, this is coming from our validation. So for example, if description is not required, refresh, submit it, well now only that one is going to be returned. Okay, the next thing I want to do though is when I start typing in, I'd like to get rid of this message here. So what we might do, let me show you a couple options. Let's bring that back. What we might do if we come up here is something like when we key down, maybe we could say errors.clear name. So when you start typing, we're going to clear out that error because it's assumed that you're changing it and the message is no longer relevant. Okay, so we have a new method here, clear, when we put it at the bottom. Clear field. And now what do we want to do? Well, we basically want to just say like if name is here, some message, we just want to delete it. So with JavaScript, we can use the delete keyword for that. You may not know this. Say delete this.errors field. Okay, so let's try it again. Create, and now if I start typing, it disappears. Okay, so that's fine, and that's cool, but I'm starting to realize I would have to do this everywhere. And it's not bad for a simple form like this, but I'm starting to imagine like those big forms where you have 30 different fields. I'd have to reproduce this, and it's not the end of the world, but I don't know. I'd hate to do that for every form. So what if we instead, I'll undo this a couple clicks, what if we instead apply key down to the form itself? And we could say key down, and we'll say errors.clear, but now I can't just hard code name anymore, it needs to be dynamic. Well, as it turns out with Vue, we can use this $event keyword, and that's going to refer to the original DOM event that was fired. So for example, if you start keying down in the input, then you could say event.target, and that's going to point to the input. And then if I further want to get the name input, I could use this. Great, so in this case, that will return name, and down here, it would return description. That should be what we want. All right, let's give that a shot. So we run it, it fails, I start typing, and it disappears. I type on this one, and that disappears too. Okay, great. So that's just a nice way to dynamically do this without having to update every single input. Now, it's true for more complex forms, this may not be what you need, but for our purposes, it'll do the trick. What else? Well, one thing. If we give this a refresh and we inspect the source, you'll see that we're displaying this help span, regardless of whether we have an error or not. So you'll see that in every particular case. And sometimes for real projects, you can add some weird spacing, or you could have a red border that has nothing in it, just depending upon your styling. So maybe we need to say, we only want to do this if we have errors for the name. We could do that. So that means we would duplicate that down here. Or another option, if you want to do this with CSS alone, is you could always do something like span help that is empty. So if there's nothing in it, then display none. That's a CSS way you could tackle this. But nonetheless, I'll show you the view option. So it looks like we have this new method has. Notice how easy this is, by the way. You're just kind of creating the API you want to work with. So in a perfect world, well, if we have errors for description, then we don't want to display it. So you create a has method. So how do we do this? We're accepting the field, and we just want to say if this.errors contains a field property. Well, with JavaScript, we can use hasOwnProperty. So return this.errors.hasOwnProperty field. Okay, so let's give it a refresh. And now, if we did our job right, we should no longer see that. Open up our form, control, and yes, you don't see the span. But if we run it, then, of course, you will see the span. So do it again, and the span disappears. Great, that's what we want. Next, what else? Well, how about this? If there are errors on the page, then you shouldn't be able to resubmit the form. So I would want this button to be disabled. Okay, let's do this. We can set disabled, and we're going to bind this to a Boolean. So like if you just set disabled to true, then it will always be disabled, and I can't click on it. If you set it to false, then of course it's not disabled. So why don't we set it equal to if we have any errors at all? Now I just used the keyword any, so maybe we can add a method called any. Let's try it out. We'll say any, and what do we want to check for here? We basically want to check for if this is an empty object. Now we're not using any kind of helper libraries, so what we might do is say object.keys errors, and that's going to return an array of all of the keys. So if I had name equals Jeff or something, that would return name. So we'll just fetch an array and check the length. So if the length is more than 0, then we have errors, in which case this should return true. If it's not greater than 0, then no, we don't have errors. So let's give it another shot. We submit it, it fails, but now the submit button is disabled, so you can't keep resubmitting it until you clear it, and now you can. But now here's another thing. Let's fill this out successfully. Project description, create, and we got success. So if we give it a refresh, we see it here. But did you notice that when we filled it out, the inputs didn't clear? And maybe that's what you want, or maybe you want to be able to do this over and over, and you want to clear out these inputs. So what you might do is something like this. Right down here, when we submit, maybe we can call an onSuccess method, and then let's give you some breathing room. OnSuccess, that will accept the response, where we will continue to alert the response data message that's returned from the server. But we're also going to set this name equals an empty string, and then this.description equals an empty string. We're just manually going to update that. So yeah, that would do the trick. If we fill this out, create, we get our alert, and then we empty those out. But here's another option. This does work, but it's very specific. In order to reset those, we set name to nothing and description to nothing. We're not really describing what happens. What are we really doing here? Aren't we just sort of resetting the form? Something like that? Well, that would require a form object itself and a form class. So, dun dun dun, cliffhanger, we will tackle that in the next episode. I'll see you then.